You're listening to the Kitchen Confession Podcast with Chef Mary Mammoliti.
Pineapple on pizza is blank.
Canadian.
Good answer. I would have said wrong, but...
You know that, right? Because that's another thing that I discovered from the book. It was invented
It's Canadian?
It was invented in Chatham, Ontario.
Come on.
Invented in Chatham, Ontario by a Greek immigrant who owned a Chinese restaurant. He just died recently. And he said the reason why he thought of it is because they put a lot of pineapple in those dishes, in those kind of old-fashioned Chinese restaurants that have 100 things on the menu.
I mean, well, God rest his soul, but it was just wrong. That's Mark Cirillo. He's a food writer, author of Pizza Cultura, and 1/4 of the fabulous four that make up Cucinato, an Italian culinary studio located in Toronto's Corso, Italia. Mark, thanks for coming on the show. I can't wait to talk all things food with you.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here and excited to talk to you.
So I'm not even going to waste any more time. I'm just going to dive right in. And I'm going to start with, how did you get started as a food writer?
You know what? I have to think about that for a minute because it sort of happened organically. I have been working kind of as a freelance writer and a little bit as a marketing consultant, always kind of in the communications field for, at least the last decade or so. And, food has always been a theme. It's always been a passion of mine. And, I'm not quite sure if it was the chicken or the egg, but, in the last, say, maybe 6 to 8 years, I started working with, some people like Massimo Bruno, who's now a business partner of mine, the Italian Chamber of Commerce, Grande Cheese is another company that I've done work with. So there was various companies and organizations that I was doing work with who are basically in the food industry, but in the Italian culture industry. And the food writing kind of came out of that. But then, I guess, pretty early on, I realized it was just an interesting subject for me. So we kind of created a little blog and a brand called, at the time we were calling it Cucinato. And so I did some writing on that. But the two things kind of came together almost organically.
Well, I was also looking at your book, Pizza Cultura.
Pizza Cultura, yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I honestly, I loved it. I just kept on kind of thumbing through it and I couldn't stop at one point. But I did want to know, what was the driving force behind Pizza Cultura? And where did the idea come from?
Well, you know what? The idea actually came from Corrado Paina, who is the director of the Italian Chamber of Commerce. And Corrado's an interesting guy. He had this idea that, wouldn't it be great to do a book on pizza, because it sort of became so ubiquitous so quickly that I think people don't necessarily appreciate its origins and or its essence, if you will. And of course, the Chamber of Commerce being, in the business of promoting, information and cultural exchange between Canada and Italy. He really kind of pushed the idea. He was excited about the idea, and I, I basically, after talking to him a few times, I thought, this sounds like an interesting project. I'm going to do it. And so I wrote the book, and the Chamber of Commerce kind of, acted as the publisher and, the enabler. They helped set up a lot of the interviews, especially with people in Italy. It was fantastic. I got to talk to, some of the best and most famous pizza makers in the world, because of the connections with the chamber.
Did you get to taste? Did you get to taste test?
Yes, yeah. I tasted a lot of pizza.
I can
and also,
only imagine.
And it was great. The one guy in particular who there's a whole kind of chapter dedicated to him in the book was Franco Pepe. His little pizzeria in a remote place called Caiazzo in the mountains, this medieval village, has been named for 2 years in a row the best pizzeria in Italy. So I mean, that's pretty incredible. And I was lucky enough to not only to interview him, but then he came over here for an event for the launch of the book, and made some pizza. So I got to
Oh my God, that's amazing. My mouth is watering just thinking about it. All right, so we're gonna play a couple of games. You ready for it?
I think so, yeah.
All right, first game, this or that.
The choice is yours. You can get with this or you can get with that.
I'm gonna give you 2 words. Just select which one you think suits you best. Salty or sweet?
Salty.
Pizza or pasta?
Pasta.
Toilet paper. Over or under?
Oh, under 100%.
Really?
Yeah, it's got to be under.
Oh, we're gonna have to take this conversation further after. Toothpaste. Do you squeeze from the middle or the bottom?
I squeeze from the middle until it starts to get scarce, and then I change my strategy.
There was a part in your book where you mentioned that, this fascinated me, that in the 1950s, pizza was seen as peasant food because they ate it with their hands. And that many people were offended by that. And now, fast forward to today, it's developed into this fancier meal, even though you're still eating with your hands. But then in come the San Marzano tomatoes, 00 flour. Can you explain a little bit about like the San Marzano tomato and the importance of like 00 flour when it comes to making pizza?
Yeah, I mean, those are things that really come from the place of the origin, right? So like the San Marzano tomatoes, it's, the tomato itself it's a funny thing where, it's not a native Italian plant. It came from South America. The crazy thing is that it came to Italy as a decorative plant, and people thought it was poisonous.
Really?
They didn't even know you could eat the fruit of this plant until several hundred years after it had been brought over from South America. And then when people start, they realize that you could use the fruit. It just so happened that area of Italy, the Vesuvius area, was really an area where it just prospered. It took to that climate. There was something about the soil in that area and the climate. So San Marzano tomatoes are legendary because there's something about the property. There's a few other varieties, but San Marzano is the most famous. There's something about the climate in the region around Mount Vesuvius, and the quality of the soil and the climate. It just makes this fantastic tomato that's just...
It's got like a sweetness to it, doesn't it?
It's got a sweetness and a density of flavor that's just, it is very hard to replicate.
And when you cook that down, it's kind of like a velvety finish to it, is what I noticed.
Yeah, it's just, but it's also just fantastic. I mean, the way they would do it in a pizzeria in Naples is literally, you've got the preserved tomatoes. Sometimes they'll use fresh, but that's a slightly different style of pizza. But it's the preserved tomato that's already been peeled and it's in its juice. You just you crush it with your hands. You add just a pinch of salt and basil, and you leave it for maybe half an hour, and then it's good to go. And then you just spread that on the pizza, and like a Neapolitan pizza, it's baked for less than 2 minutes in 900 degrees, and you've got your pizzas.
And the reason why they use the 00 flour is it's because it's a finer flour, is it not?
For sure. It's extremely fine flour. So it's the finest flour that exists. So that it has a distinctive lightness to it. Sort of the caveat there is that 00 is for sure the gold standard. But, there are a variety of 00 flours. Like Italy is just crazy for the number. There's like hundreds or thousands of flours. I don't know. There's so many. But so there's not only there are different brands, but, if you talk about somebody like we were talking about Franco Pepe earlier, somebody like that who's a skilled pizza maker, really a pizza chef, I would call him. He has his own blend. So those, your question about the San Marzano tomatoes, they really, of course, they've always been, kind of like the gold standard of a plum tomato,
Mm-hmm.
partly because they're great, and partly because that's where, tomato sauce itself comes from Naples. That's that thing that's so iconic, whether it's on pasta or pizza.
Mm-hmm.
It's that area in Campania where it was created. So it's partly about the origin. It's partly about the quality of the thing. And then the third factor that made it kind of very famous, that at this point many people know what a San Marzano tomato is that around the 80s or so, the 1980s, I guess I would say early 80s, there started to be the formation of these things called consortiums. They existed in the past, but they were more for things like, like a variety of wine or cheese. But in Naples, for the first time in the 1980s, there was a group of people. They were pizzerias, really, the oldest pizzerias in the city, that came together and tried to put on paper what is, an authentic Neapolitan pizza. Which, you can imagine, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall, in that room. Like, sure,
Mm-hmm.
these families that have been making pizza for, hundreds of years, got together and tried to agree on what were the basic principles of a pizza, how you made it, and what were the essential ingredients. But it was
I
out
think we
of
can
that.
almost play that out. I think we can almost play that out in our heads.
Yeah,
Already know
it
a
would
lot
be
of
a
loud
pretty.
talking
Yeah, exactly. And remember, we're
and
talking
gestures.
Naples here, right? Not
Yeah.
known for being like a relaxed, chilled out kind of. It's very animated culture. So it sounds, and that was another thing that was great about the book. I got to talk to Antonio Pace, who was the founder of the consortium. He's still around, and he's the president still. But so those guys, it was kind of humble at first, but then it became this global thing where, today there are Neapolitan style pizzerias everywhere in the world, whether you're talking about Buenos Aires or Toronto or Tokyo. They have these pizzerias that are basically emulating that style of pizza. And when you think about that and you look at the style of pizza, and then you think about the style of pizza that we grew up with in a place like Toronto, you can see how it's different and why these guys might have at a certain point said, hey, we want to put a stake in the ground and say, this is the true Neapolitan pizza.
So we're going to go to rapid fire. Name 5 foods you always keep in your fridge at all times.
Well, let's see. Tomato, milk, what else? Eggs, some kind of vegetable like celery and carrots,
Mm-hmm.
and tomato paste is always in there.
Favorite snack?
Favorite snack, honestly, is crusty bread and cheese, and
that's so good.
a little bicchiere di vino. No,
Nice. Hard cheese?
I'm a real sucker for aged cheese. Yeah, I love the stinkier the better.
Yeah. I'm with you. So, a celebrity you would love to cook for?
To cook for? Oh, wow, geez. I don't know. You got me there. I'm thinking like celebrity chefs, but who would I cook for? If we're talking Italian, we could say Giovanotti, just because he would be fun to talk to. Just the conversation would be interesting while I'm cooking.
Okay, this one to me is near and dear to my heart.
Okay.
Pineapple on pizza is blank.
Canadian.
Good answer. I would have said wrong, but
You know that, right? Because that's another thing that I discovered from the book. It was invented.
It's Canadian?
It was invented in Chatham, Ontario.
Come on.
It's in the book. It's invented in Chatham, Ontario by a Greek immigrant who owned a Chinese restaurant.
Oh, that's a book in itself.
He just died recently. And he said the reason why he thought of it is because at the China, I mean, you're talking about like American style Chinese food. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
probably not what they eat in China, but he said like they put a lot of pineapple in those dishes, in those kind of old fashioned, Chinese restaurants that have 100 things on the menu. And it just, he said like that's what gave him the idea of putting pineapple on the pizza.
I mean, well, God rest his soul, but it was just wrong.
Well, that's the thing. But this is the amazing thing, though. Do you remember there was this controversy, like this? I think it was about a year or so ago. The president of Iceland made a comment like it should be outlawed, just as a joke. But then it went completely viral all over the world.
Yes, I remember this.
Right. So, but that shows you. But that was incredible to me. I thought, here's this thing that was invented in Chatham, Ontario. Love it or hate it. And it's a global phenomenon.
It's
like people
global.
are debating it in Australia and New Zealand and Iceland.
It's one of those hot topic questions. I'm Mary Mamalidi, and you're listening to the Kitchen Confession Podcast. Today I'm talking with Mark Cirillo, author of Pizza Cultura, food writer, and restaurateur. Publishing your first book, has that changed your process of writing?
That's a good question. Has it changed my process of writing? I think that it made me just do it in a little bit more than I might if I'm doing an article. I think I tend to be like, I take too long to just do it, And when you're doing a book, it's like, and I kind of had the blessing and the curse of like, a pretty short timeline. So, I don't know. I just, I would say that at first, when I first started doing the book, I thought, I've got basically 6 months to do this. This might be, I was feeling a little bit unsure about it. But then I just kind of put my head down. And I think, just having to do that much writing in that short of time, it just, it did teach me to, just to be efficient because, if you're doing an article or a shorter piece, I find sometimes that you don't focus as much as you should until it's like really, you're close to your deadline. Whereas with a book project, I mean, that's just not an option, right? So, I think it allowed me to, in a way, just kind of relax a little bit more and just sort of like get the information out there. And just decisive and quick in my decision making as a writer.
What are common traps for aspiring food writers that they may run into?
It's kind of an odd time for writing and for content because there aren't the budgets that there used to be.
Would you attribute that to social media because everything is online and so accessible
and free? So that there's because everything's free.
Yeah.
There aren't the advertising dollars, and therefore, the editorial departments of, media. It's just a fraction of what it used to be. So therefore, most writing is kind of amateur writing these days, and I mean that in a bad way, but it's just sort of like you don't have the budgets to pay people to be full-time journalists, and so. I don't know. You're asking sort of about the pitfalls, but maybe a bigger problem is sort of figure out like if you want to do food writing, like where does that fit in, and how can you do it? And then the second thing is, the easiest thing is to kind of be sort of a generic food blogger where you have. You kind of, get a lot of free stuff and go to a bunch of free events, and you're expected to, announce that there's a new restaurant opening and that kind of stuff. But it sort of depends like what your interest is. But if you're interested in the food, I think, the thing is to just, write about the thing and then try to find an audience. Because these days there aren't that many jobs out there. It's not like somebody hired you to do this podcast, right? So you're doing it because you're passionate about it, and then you're trying to find an audience and some way to make it economically viable. I think that's just sort of the way it works these days, whether you like it or not,
And I figure if I'm passionate about it, there are other people out there that are as well.
That's right. Yeah, for sure.
And just trying to reconnect people back to food and the kitchen and not looking for that quick, pick up and run and walk and eat while you're walking to the next stop. It's just this kind of hoping that people will reconnect back with the kitchen.
Yeah. And, from a media perspective, I mean, the bad news is that there aren't the budgets there used to be, but the good news is that, you can do things like this podcast in a way that you couldn't do in the past. I mean, it's
that's right. I'm thankful for that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's just a different, for somebody who's, I'm not in my 20s, so I remember how things used to be and how they are now, and it's just sort of like understanding what the opportunities are and making the most of them.
A little while ago, and you told me something that I found really interesting about when pizza came to Toronto,
mm-hmm.
who started and who actually taught or trained other places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which I found really interesting.
I got to talk to Eddie Pugliese, who's the only surviving brother. He opened the first pizzeria in Toronto. It's called Vesuvio, and it's actually still there on Dundas Street West, just a little bit west of Kill Street. And he came from basically the Reggio Calabria region. And so he and his brothers were just kind of late teens at the time, and they were in Pennsylvania for a couple of years, and they came down and they were visiting their cousins, and their cousins basically said, there's no pizza in Toronto. You guys should come open a pizzeria. Like there's always, because at that time, it was like I guess it was mid 50s, because, that was when the wave of immigration started happening here in Toronto. So they said, the cousin said, well, you should come down. And sure enough, they went to a little bakery in New York City, which was called Vesuvio. And they taught, they learned how to make pizza. And yeah, they came here in the late 50s, and it was, instantly like very popular in the Italian neighborhoods, but it didn't take long for it to spread, to the greater culture. But, so that was Eddie Pugliese and Vesuvio. And it was a very popular place. He told me, at its, in its heyday, they would get over 300 people there, on a Saturday night, and it would be open, very late. So it was a real kind of cultural place too. And so many of the, iconic businesses around Toronto, like whether it's, Pizza or Regina's Pizza on College, or just there's so many of these iconic places that were kind of came out of Vesuvio.
Now on to Cucinato.
Cucinato, yes.
Frank and I had the pleasure of attending
yes.
the Calabrese class with Chef Luciano, and we had a fantastic evening, but everyone else needs to know about this. Tell me a bit about Cucinato. What does the name mean? Where did the idea come from? I want to know all about it.
Yes, thank you. So the Cucinato, it's it's an idea that's been it's been kind of germinating for I would say I'm going to say about 4 or 5 years. Like we myself and some of my collaborators. So Massimo Bruno, who I'd mentioned, I think earlier in this podcast, is another chef who's part of that. We have been talking about creating something that's kind of a cultural thing. It's about the food, but it's about Italian culture, but here in Toronto. So Cucinato, I actually came up with the name again about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was kind of a pun. So Cucinato means cooked, but as you know, there's kind of this convention like blog Tio, so Cucina Toronto. So it was this idea of Italian food, but not just from a nostalgic perspective. Of course, we love tradition and we're very interested in tradition, but we're also interested in the present and where things are going. And we're in Toronto. We're not in Calabria. So it's just sort of like a way to convey what the history of food is and where things come from, but not necessarily in a nostalgic way.
What I do like to do is ask all my guests to share one of their kitchen confessions with me.
Funny, I remember one, but frankly, it was a mixed one. And that was like many years ago when my sister and I were probably like in our teens, and we thought that we knew how to cook, but we didn't necessarily know that much. And we had a party. It might have been New Year's or something like that, and we thought we were going to make this fancy dinner, and it was something that we didn't really know what we were doing. And I forget the exact details, but the gist of it is that my sister, she had this recipe and it said something about stock, and we didn't have stock, so she went and she bought the powdered stuff, but we never used that stuff. And so she put, like, when they say like put in this much stock, she put in that much powder. So I didn't actually do it, but I was there and I saw it, and I didn't think anything of it until we tasted the food, and it was just like the whole effing dinner was just like, no, that's garbage. We're gonna phone for a pizza. So
and there's your kitchen confession.
That was sort of like, you should have asked Nona or Mama or something, but like, don't think, So
that is hilarious.
That's like a lesson in humility. That was, I mean, I think I've had some mishaps, but that was the worst one I can remember. It was just like literally like one taste and like, nope, that's not gonna work at all.
It's that time. We've reached the end of another show. Be sure to visit kitchenconfession.com for more recipes and foodie finds. I'd like to thank producer and editor Matt Agnew, and I'm Mary Mamaliti. See you at the next episode.